Hi, this is Frank Yanis, host of Smarter Food Safety. Thanks for joining us. This episode is going to be a bit of a departure from our usual focus on food safety. Today, we're going to focus on a topic that is reaching fever pitch in our country and the subject of new and expected food regulations. And that topic is nutrition, dietary choices, and their role in chronic diseases. I'm going to be joined today by Dr. Sophie Attwood. She's a Cambridge-trained behavioral scientist who studies human health challenges tied to today's food system and today's food choices. There's no question about it. Poor diets are now a major driver of chronic diseases in the United States, including obesity, heart disease, and diabetes, among others. But influencing healthier food choices by the public isn't simple. There are no silver bullets, and what we think might work, well, it might not. Today, we're going to explore the science behind proposed policies and whether they're likely to make a difference. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss this episode. The Smarter Food Safety Podcast is sponsored by Ecolab, a trusted partner throughout my career. They're dedicated to protecting what's vital by advancing food safety, ensuring clean and safe environments, and enhancing water quality around the world. Well, hi, Sophie. It's so good to see you, and I can't tell you how delighted I am to have you on the Smarter Food Safety Podcast. For our listeners, they know we generally do deep dives, Sophie, on food safety topics. But the issue of nutrition and the health of the nation is so critical. It's such a big conversation here in the U.S. I wanted to dedicate an episode to that topic in particular. And Sophie, as I thought about it, I've followed your work. I thought Dr. Sophie Attwood would be a great person to have on the podcast because I followed your work. And what has intrigued me is your behavioral science background. I know that you're Cambridge trained, have a PhD in behavioral science, and you've really focused on issues related to food and human health. I've seen it in countries around the world, not only in Europe, but in the Middle East and Asia, including the US. I've seen the brands that you've worked with, and I've actually followed your research. And so I'm so grateful, but a lot of our listeners are really hardcore food safety professionals. They won't know a little bit about you, I suspect. And so, Sophie, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work and what you're currently up to these days?
Frank, thank you for the invite. It's really nice to be here. So I'm a behavioral scientist, as you mentioned. I have a background in psychology. So for those who don't know, behavioral science is really just looking at the causes and kind of consequences of human behavior. And we use methods from psychology, including experiments, to explore that. The area I work in is food generally. So I do stuff on food waste and I do stuff on healthy dietary shifts and sustainable dietary shifts. So really looking at how we can get people to change their food choices in the direction that we'd like them to go in, which generally is kind of less salt, fat, sugar, more plant-based, more fruit and vegetables. And I've been doing that about maybe, I guess, on and off 10 years now, but I've been focusing quite specifically into sustainable food since about 2018. So it's coming on 6 years.
And I know you founded a group called Behavioral Global. And what really has intrigued me in the work that I've followed is how you're so focused on having evidence-based kind of decision-making for the policies that we implement. It's, we'll say this a couple of times in today's podcast. It's not good intentions that really matter most, because good intentions are everywhere, but are the actions that we're taking, are the policies that we're implementing, are they actually evidence-based? And so your behavioral science background and your research is really interesting. I've titled today's conversation, Front of Pack Food Labels, Are They Nudge or Are They Noise? And we want to hear from you, again, from a behavioral science standpoint. I think, at a high level, let's just start off with this idea that we know chronic diseases are a real challenge in countries such as the United States and other developed countries around the world. We see how, dietary practices impact the health of a nation, whether it's heart disease, obesity, diabetes. And not only is it important, Sophie, as you know, for people's personal health, but for the health of the nation and even the economies of the nation, obviously. And so countries around the world are taking notice and they want to do things, right? And so we're going to dive into this topic of front of pack labeling and probably a couple of policies that are really big kind of in focus in the US right now. But before we get into that, I just wanted to hear from you at a macro level, at a systemic levels, really high level, 30,000-foot view. Why do you think these issues of chronic diseases are so important today, one quarter of the way into the 21st century? What are some of the bigger factors that are driving just chronic diseases being such an important topic right now in this moment in time?
I mean, the vast majority of chronic diseases are lifestyle related, and the big things there are smoking, alcohol, physical inactivity, and then dietary choices. And in the diet category, we have people not consuming enough of the good stuff. So it's all the vitamins and minerals and the nutrients that is found in primarily plant-based food, but kind of whole foods in general. And then too much of the bad stuff, which, as I mentioned, is the salt, the fat, the sugar, ultra processed foods. And we nowadays are almost the victims of our own success, because no longer are we struggling in many countries with lack of access to sufficient nutrients, but we've kind of got overnutrition at this point in time. So really, we're in a food environment that's surrounded by a real excess of food that's been very cleverly manufactured and marketed. So we purchase an excess of it, as well as engineering out a lot of the physical activity that we used to do, just by virtue of the fact that life's a lot more convenient nowadays. So you put those together,
Great.
and I guess we've had sufficient time since that's started, because that's been this process has been ongoing kind of as countries have industrialized. So the lag time on that has got us to where we are now, which is a situation where chronic disease rates are some of the highest they've ever been, and they're affecting people younger and younger. So we now see kind of rates of lifestyle diseases starting to emerge in childhood, which is kind of unheard of before. So really, I'd say like a victim of our own success in creating a food system that's prioritized kind of efficiency and convenience over many other aspects.
That's interesting. Okay, so it is a unique set of circumstances. As you said, I like the term "victim of our own success." We live in a stage of abundance. Many generations, as they are far removed from hunger, right? And then our lifestyle as well. We just don't. I know here in the U.S. we don't walk that much. Nobody walks to the store. Everybody gets in an automobile to go to the store. I don't see as much physical activity in the streets as I used to when I was growing up, and kids playing behind video games. And so it's a combination of factors. So let's just talk a little bit about this one intervention that people are talking about. There are multiple interventions, but I want to do a pause on this one intervention, which is front of pack food labeling. And
Mm.
again, well-intentioned, and this is just a discussion for the audience to hear. Well, do we think it's going to be effective or not? What's going to be the outcome? And so the reason I'm so interested in it is, I think about over the course of my profession, and when we put nutrition fact labels on food packages in the United States, and for those decades after decades, we thought, hey, providing this type of information to consumers is a good thing, and it is. But it didn't really achieve that much. We actually saw obesity epidemic soar. So, you now have this nutrition facts panel on the side of every package. People can look at it, make informed choices, and obesity soars. And so some of us say, well, is this going to work or is it not going to work? And I remember a conversation I had with you that said, well, Frank, there's a host of evidence out there. It's not like we've got to shoot in the dark. There's been a lot of studies. There've been a lot of attempts in other countries. But maybe we'll start off with this front of pack food labeling concept. And before we dive into whether it'll work or not, there are different types of front of pack food labels. So if you know better than I've seen some of them that are called interpretive and non-interpretive. Maybe you can educate our audience on what are the different type of food, front of pack food labels, how they're different, and what's being done where.
So labels are one tool in a very broad toolbox of things we can do to target the food environment around people. And they're one that's been under focus for a really long time, partly because they work kind of with the consumer model. So the idea behind them was, the rationale really went, consumers are over consuming products that are bad for them because they lack awareness of what's in the product, and they don't know what leads to good health and bad health. Hence, we will label the front of the food with very clear information, and that will fix the problem of them not knowing. That's an assumption that could be questioned
Oh, right.
on a few different levels. So firstly, people do generally know what is bad and good for them, but that isn't the key reason why they're eating food. And then there's another assumption in there that people are actually reading the labels. People understand the information in the labels. So there's a lot of assumptions under this, which is one reason why it's not a favoured approach from the behavioural science perspective. However, that hasn't stopped people researching them, and a lot of research has gone in the last 10 or so years trying to understand the best format of label to use. And we've got various different types that have been trialed. So the ones that are quite information heavy, I think you're calling them non-interpretive, that just gives you the nutrition facts. I'll tell you how many calories, how many grams of fat, protein, and won't do any of the heavy lifting for you. And then there's been more interpretive versions, which include the favoured one, which is at the moment traffic light labeling. So it's a red, amber, green system on the different nutrients in the food. We use this very widely across UK and Europe. And green will indicate a nutrient that's in a quantity that's suitable within your recommended daily allowance of that nutrient. Red indicates that it's very high in an ingredient that could damage your health. So, for example, snacks like potato chips would definitely get a red on salt intake because the levels of sodium in that product are going to be really high. The idea with these ones being really that they're designed in a way to make it easier for the consumer to understand the labels. Long and short of it is that neither class work as well as we would want it to for various reasons, not just about how the label's designed.
Right. Okay. That's interesting because I know it's well-intentioned. People think, hey, if you're putting these types of symbols, traffic lights on the front of a package, will that affect consumer behavior? And, I described this, tried to be cute and provocative in the title of the podcast, nudge or noise, because there is a lot of labels, right? There's a lot on a food label these days. You can see it's GMO free or it's natural or it's healthy, and now there'll be a traffic light. And I worked in retail for a very long time. So what I've learned is it's not what people say they'll do, because a lot of these surveys, as you know, oftentimes they're asking consumers what they'll do. But we always said, measure, watch their behavior. How do they spend their dollars? That's the real proof. And so that's the question I'm getting. Is this a nudge? And we know that's a behavioral science term that says, it doesn't force you, but it provides you, or pushes you in the direction to make a smart or healthy choice. Or will it be noise at the end of the day? And some of the surveys I've seen suggested that maybe initially people will pay attention, certainly the people that want to pay attention to it, but longer term, it doesn't have some type of sustainable, lasting effect. Now, Sophie, I know by coincidence you're in Greece. You actually live in Greece now. I didn't know that when I first contacted you because I'm of Greek descent. But the UK in particular has actually worked on this traffic light front of pack label. Do you know any of the data or evidence? Did it work there? What's been the UK experience?
So generally when they've studied the labels before they launched them in the market, they tend to do these in a laboratory setting. And by that we mean kind of you'll show people products online, like an online supermarket setup with the labels, and you'll get them to mimic what they would buy or choose in real life.
Right.
And or you show people different versions of labels side by side, and you ask them questions about clarity or kind of which ones they like the most. The traffic light labels come out quite high in terms of consumers like the labels. They find them clear, they understand them. And in laboratory settings, there is some evidence that they influence choice. However, when you scale that into kind of supermarket settings, it's generally where they're generally on pack rather than on menus, these labels.
Mhm.
If you imagine looking at a shelf in the supermarket, the amount of visual information that's coming in at you, you have all the range of products, the price information, you have all the branding, all the packaging, the brand names, the images, like in addition to which you have all the rest of the stimuli that's coming in at you from what you're listening to, what you can smell, etc. And just in that context, there's so much noise
Right.
that you really have to be somebody who's looking out for that information to be able to pick that up very specifically and have it influence your choice in a large way. So the evidence is when you scale it into real world retail, the evidence is the effect is a lot smaller than you find in this more controlled laboratory setting. That said, the thing that seems to be working with the traffic lights is red the red color seems to be the thing that people are responding to. So generally people will try to avoid red, but the differentiation between the green and the amber is not really happening very much. So there's some movement away from the very worst products, but they're not working particularly well to maximize choice of the optimal products that you'd want people to buy for health. So to be like very strict, I'd say they don't work that well. But to be a bit more pragmatic, they're one tool in the toolbox, so they can do different things. So, for
Right.
example, they can help open up broader conversation about nutrition. They can help as a tool for people to begin to start understanding about nutrition, and they can force or encourage certain companies to reformulate the products. Because if you're a company and all your products are red, it's not a very good look. So, in that basis, it can force the change back up the food system rather than down towards the consumer.
Possibly reformulation. Yeah, there's a proposal right now in the U.S. The Secretary of HHS has said that they're looking at front of pack labels. It's been something the U.S. FDA has been researching and looking for a while, but in some public comments, he's talked about, red, yellow, green, and so people are thinking it might be the traffic light option. But certainly, as you stated, I know, having worked with big brands, nobody wants a red dot on the front of their package, and so it might force
Yeah.
some reformulation. I think before that, it's going to probably cause a lot of debate, Sophie, on, well, how do you determine whether it's red, yellow, or green? And so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Okay, so one tool in the toolbox, not going to be a silver bullet or magic solution, and might be a little bit of a nudge for some, might be some noise for others that aren't paying attention because they're overwhelmed, to your point, with all the other things you see in the grocery store: price,
Mm.
odor, taste. So we'll see how this plays out. Again, I think we're all rooting for success. This conversation is intended to say, well, what are the levers or what are the tools that we should be trying to utilize to actually get people to make smarter and healthier food choices? I think a conversation on front of pack labels would be amiss if I didn't actually add in this concept, Sophie, of ultra processed foods, because, it's a term that's been used so much over this past year, especially here in the United States. And the desire by our government to define what is an ultra processed food. There are different definitions, some referred to more often than not. But what is your general kind of feeling about a definition of ultra processed food? Do you think that, knowing what you know about human behavior and making smart and healthy food choices, do you think defining foods as ultra processed or not, is that going to be effective or useful?
This is a really interesting topic because, from the perspective of working in diet and nutrition for many years, it's been interesting to see how the UPF framing has been so successful at getting people's attention. For all intents and purposes, we've been talking about junk food for 20 years, 30 years
Mm,
now,
mm.
and it has never received such a kind of media attention and just general, conversations everywhere about ultra processed foods. Something about this terminology has stuck. And when you look at the psychology of it, it seems to be tapping into a few implicit psychological biases that we hold. The first one being something called naturalistic bias, which is basically that we tend to think anything that we believe to be natural is good. So regardless of things like bacteria and pathogens can come from poison, can come from nature, we still generally think if the same product, meat's a really good example. So lab-grown meat and regular meat, if we talk about the risks of those two products, people will always choose the traditional meat, the natural meat, because they believe it's natural, so it's good, for example. So people have a bit of an implicit fear of anything that's conceived of as over-processed and unnatural. It taps into a kind of part of our what we call a behavioral immune system. So we're innately scared of things that have been processed. We think they could have been tampered with in some way. There's some malintent there. So it's a trust thing. We're also very skeptical, generally psychologically, of the new and the unfamiliar, because it could potentially be risky, which we call in psychology neophobia. There's a specific type of neophobia that's called food tech neophobia, where if you have a new food innovation or technology, and many of the UPFs are made, using different types of technology, we also don't like that because we kind of, again, we don't trust it. We're not sure what it is. So I think Whereas the products that are generally damaging in the ultra processed foods will be the ones that have been around for years, like the salt, like the sugar, like the saturated fat. The framing within the idea of processing has actually very usefully kind of landed the point to consumers that these products aren't very good for you because they've caught on to these psychological biases, would be my understanding of what's happening,
Mm.
which is good, really good for kind of visibility of the argument, but it's very risky from the perspective of kind of misinformation around food because it's tapping into a core fear. It's very easy for that to be manipulated. There's a lot of messaging out there that's really inaccurate about which food production processes are risky to people. So I think it remains to be seen as to what gets done with the public interest in UPFs and how that's dealt with, as to how that will play out.
Yeah. That's interesting, Sophie, because, I am of Greek descent, and I always say, I'm pro-global and pro-local food. I'm pro-process and pro-natural food, pro-technology and pro kind of the way things used to be done. But I do see a lot of fear on new technologies being used on food. And to your point, this whole concept about cell-cultivated meats has gone off scale. People saying, we're going to ban them. You can't produce them in this state, or you can't produce them in this country. And I think it speaks to what you're saying about just kind of natural fear of them. And I also am concerned right now, the definition seems really, really broad, so there are
Mm.
things that I like to consume, like my Greek yogurt. I've been consuming it every morning for years. I think some Greek yogurts might be defined as ultra processed, and I think it's actually a really good thing. There've been one study here in the US that says about 70% of all foods, 70% of all foods in the grocery store will be defined as ultra processed. So that's just inconceivable to me. And so, do you think there could be some unintended consequences by ultra processed? What would those be?
Well, definitely from the perspective of kind of novel foods and novel food production. So, I mean, I work a lot in sustainable food, and the big challenge we're trying to work on is how we feed what's going to be close to 10 billion people by the middle of the century, trying not to cut down any more rainforest and trying to supply
Mm,
good quality nutrition to people. It's a really difficult equation to put the pieces together. And a very important part of that will be the introduction of novel food production processes. So things like plant-based meats or plant-based proteins. And what's happened is they've been subsumed under the ultra processed food kind of umbrella. And so many products that have been basically engineered to be optimized foods. So they're trying to kind of either produce nutrients efficiently, or they're trying to, feed people where we need the nutrients. I think they're going to get swept up in the definition.
mm,
And some of that has been purposeful from the perspective of lobbies that are interested in protecting traditional agricultural products. So kind of livestock farming, for example. So some of it's been intentional kind of misinformation, and the other part is just, as I said, people's natural psychological biases, just tapping into it. So we have a bit of a difficult task to try to, and it's always challenging nutrition because it's such a complex thing to pull apart the fact from the fiction and try to kind of land what is actually quite a nuanced message. So sometimes processing and some types of processing are bad. Other types of processing are actually optimization or fortification or reformulation of foods. And that's been done for years across the whole of the food system, really to benefit people's health. If you think about things like adding extra vitamins and calcium, etc., to things like breakfast cereals or kind of
right.
plant-based milks, etc. So yeah, there could definitely be some unintended consequences. And I mean, maybe they are intended consequences for certain parties who are interested in kind of supporting the incumbent industry that the novel food is looking to substitute
Right.
or replace some of.
Right, right. That makes perfect sense. And you mentioned it, and it was the first time I actually saw the two terms in the same sentence or paragraph. It was some work that you wrote that I was reading, Sophie, where you talked about junk food and ultra processed food. And it was only when I read your article that I thought, that makes perfect sense. I was raised to say there's junk food. There was junk food in the 70s when I was growing up as a kid. And, my parents told me, you can occasionally have some junk food, but don't overindulge in it. Do you see a difference between junk food and ultra processed food? or you think it's largely terminology? And it's interesting how you say that, because I always say the words we use are important. They can instill emotion, right? They can instill fear.
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument has been that the ultra-processed food encompasses the downstream kind of byproducts of the processing that could be potentially dangerous to health. So, example, it would be something like trans fats as a production from the processing itself, whereas junk food, I think, was more focused on the nutritional profile of the food. However, if you are worried about your health, which I mean, nearly everyone is in some format,
Right.
there's a large body of evidence that the aspects of nutrition will damage your health, salt being probably the biggest one. I mean,
Hmm.
it's one of the leading risk factors for disease and death because it contributes to hypertension. So that would be something that I would be much more worried about for my own personal health than a potential byproduct of processing from some product with unknown, probably safe impact on health that might be in a slice of bread.
Right.
It's just because these things like sugar and salt are so ever present in the food system, we kind of don't really see them as risk factors anymore. They're almost background factors, but actually these are the key contributors to health. So my sense is they are different, but effectively the big risk factors in food have and always are going to be the same. And the kind of core message of just eat a healthy, balanced diet hasn't really changed despite all the
Right.
debates over the years.
Right. So Sophie, how do you see this? Because I think this largely leads to demonize what I would describe as demonizing some foods. And I remember hearing you talk about, yeah, you need to educate people about the types of foods and which one makes smarter choices. But it's not only what you eat, but how you eat. And that was a phrase that really stuck to me. How do you describe the difference between not only what you eat, but how you eat? Because it seems like we're really focused on the what and not the how.
Yeah, I guess there's like in nutrition, we always talk about there's no bad foods, but there's bad dietary patterns. So, for example, like you said, you can have, junk food every now and again, and in and of itself, the one item is not going to be damaging. But if you eat that item every day, that's where the problem comes. So, I think one move has been to shift away from looking at single foods to looking at patterns of people's diets.
Hmm.
And then the question becomes, well, how do you shift an entire dietary pattern? And that's where the behavioral science would come in. And that's where there is no single answer to the problem. You get this multiple toolbox of techniques. So we quite commonly work with something that got developed by University College London a few years back, which is called the behavior change technique taxonomy. And it's a big list of different behavior change tactics, one of which is labeling, but there's many others. And actually, if you look at that taxonomy, there's 93 separate behavior change techniques that we can use.
Wow.
And all of these have value as levers for change to help people modify what they're eating. And they range from everything from kind of very specifically, very heavy information, facts and skill building all the way through to shifting the broader food environment that surrounds a person. So their default or their kind of habits are almost kind of constrained or nudged by the environment for them. So it goes from very strong conscious control and need for personal regulation all the way through to the environment doing all the heavy lifting for you.
Wow. Well, that's just hearing you say 93 different tools. What's coming out through this conversation for me is that there is no easy answer to this. And it's probably a series of actions that we have to take as a society to try to influence behavioral change and smarter, healthy eating choices. And it seems when I hear you speak that this isn't going to happen overnight. We've heard some elected officials say, we're going to try to make a measurable impact on improved public health through diet. And sometimes they're saying in just a few short years. And every time I hear that, I cringe. Again, while I'm rooting for success, it's that seems like an overpromise and underdeliver type of soundbite, because I think the changes, to your point, you said we're kind of victims of our own success. It's a unique moment in human history. I think it could take generations. Am I thinking about this correctly? This isn't a fast change.
I know because it's not just a kind of immediate thing that you as an individual do interacting with your environment. It requires a wholesale change to the food environment. And that will be things like changing the types of products that are supplied, changing the layout of stores, changing the meals that you get served in restaurants. And if you think about the whole of the supply chain that's reliant on, you'd have to be having to change the whole of that supply chain to get to the downstream kind of difference in products on offer and to the consumer, as well as things like large scale population education, health campaigns,
Mm,
influence of the
yeah.
media, what happens in schools. So yeah,
Wow.
many years.
It's going to take a while. All right. I like to ask this question generally as we start getting near the end, knowing it's unrealistic, but it provides a lot of, I think, insights into how some of these smart people that we have on this podcast think. And so, Sophie, let's pretend you had a magic wand, and I don't believe in magic, but you could wave your magic wand and implement, national food policy with ease. Because we just said that with 93 tools in the toolbox, we happen to be talking about two of them, defining ultra processed foods in front of food labels. But if you had a magic wand and you could pull maybe on 3 to 5 tools that would be, the top of your list of these are things I'd do to try to implement national change, what would they be?
Firstly, massively increasing the comparative availability of healthy products, healthy, sustainable products. So if you think about if you go into a restaurant, and a big part of my work is trying to encourage people away from eating too much processed and ruminant meat for the climate benefits. And if you think about you go into a restaurant and you look at the number of items on the menu that contain meat and the number that contain a vegetarian or vegan, for example, the ratio will be something like 80 to 20 or 90 to 10. What you would want in an ideal world is that ratio completely flipped. So the vast majority of dishes or products on offer to people are healthy ones, to set the norm that these are the items that kind of should form the basis of most of the diet, and also to make them far easier to choose.
Mm,
With that, the products also obviously need to be priced well so people can afford to buy them, and they need to taste good, or people need to be that kind of more aware of how to produce them in ways that taste good. So I think it's kind of the broad argument we always go for is widespread availability of kind of easily accessible, healthy options at a good price, the converse of which is much less availability of the unhealthy options and increasing the price of them. These are the big levers that will generally work. It's just that it becomes a more complicated debate really about freedom of choice. And the argument has always been we're not restricting choice, we're just tipping the choice incentives.
right.
And that's so, you know, and that's a very big argument we could get into, because the idea is who makes the current decision of what you think is normal now. No choice operates in a vacuum. You're always being influenced. It just depends who you're being influenced by. But from the perspective of the evidence on what works, these techniques that really work on the environment around the person and don't rely on kind of upskilling the individual and making sure they're having to regulate their choices and really think about what they're buying, and they know a lot about nutrition. These are the big things that will work broadly for population health overall.
Great. And how about portion sizes, Sophie? I know that for me, that seems like such a smart play. When I go into the grocery store, I go into the convenience store and I look at these pack sizes. I travel a lot here in the US, and in airports, there's no small pack sizes. Everything's large, and I want a snack, but I don't want that big bag. And I know if I buy the big bag, I'll be tempted to finish it. What are your thoughts on portion size? It seems like it's underutilized.
Yeah, I mean, it has a massive influence on how much you eat. So the size of the portion signifies what's normal to you. Like, we're not very good at really knowing what's a large portion. It's completely relative. And the size of the pack will give you the signal. So if the size of the pack is small and that's considered normal, that's how much you think you're going to eat. And that's how much you will get full on eating. You
Hmm.
make that much bigger and the whole thing flips, and you'll eat the amount that you're given and you'll be full on that amount. So it's a kind of, there is no real objective standards for what people consider large and small. I think one intervention option is just offering a wider range of portion sizes, so small, medium, and large at different price points. So if you go into a restaurant, you could be able to choose which it would be great if you want to, for example, instead of eating one big meal, you want to share the meals, or if you're someone who has a smaller appetite, you can go for a smaller portion size. I don't know why many restaurants don't do that more. I guess perhaps it's been not economically viable for them to do for some
Right.
reason. But that said, kind of with the advent of the GLP-1s, and many people now are looking for these smaller portion sizes, especially if,
Protein.
yeah, nutritionally optimized foods. I think perhaps the kind of portion size play is going to be something that we see a bit more of in the kind of upcoming years, and it will play a role only if people aren't compensating later on in the day. So one potential risk is that when you think to yourself, "Oh, I chose the smaller portion," you kind of tricked yourself into thinking that you almost have a kind of calories left over to play with, and you might then later down the road be like, "Oh, I had the smaller thing then," so you offset
Right.
your choice. So we need some research really to understand that offsetting to see if that's happening. But I think
Right.
broadly, it's probably a good idea to offer a wider range of portions.
Yeah, when I do get to visit Greece, and I'll be there in a couple of weeks, Sophie, real common practice when we go out with family to eat, everybody doesn't order their own meal. I just sit back, they order, and food comes to the center of the table, and then everybody picks a little bit. And it strikes me as though people aren't overeating because everybody's just nibbling on a shared platter. I don't know what you think about that as a strategy, but that seems more cultural than really government
Yeah,
policy.
I think the relationship to food in the Mediterranean is obviously very different, and it's not just the ingredients, it's kind of style of eating, the pace, and the meaning of food. I mean, meals are generally shared here, and they're generally kind of affairs that last. Like it's very rare that you get to a meal in Greece and you can get out of it within a couple of hours. It's really a kind of
Yeah.
you're in. It's like a marathon. But I
Yeah.
mean, so it's almost the food as a complement to the conversation rather than it
Right.
being, necessarily seen as fuel. I think one of the really I think the meze is an interesting one because, like you said, it's all shared. So some kind of social codes playing out, which I think in some ways may stop overeating. It also means that there's a larger range of often plant-based options because many of the
Right.
inherently Mediterranean dishes are really delicious. I mean, they do vegetables very well here, and they're never seen as the side dish that you have to have with the meat. They're a dish that's kind of celebrated and enjoyed in their own right because they are delicious. So I think that's also playing into it here is that there is you're offering a wider choice of these really tasty options that aren't considered inferior to a kind of plate that would otherwise be meat. In the UK, we say meat and two veg on the plate, and that's how we structure the meals. So yeah, I think we could definitely learn something from the
Good.
Mediterranean and food culture.
Good. Because I subscribed to the Mediterranean diet growing up that way, and, I think it's healthy. Everything I've read, it tends to be pretty healthy, and as you said, I mean, we love the veggies, right? We love the salad and the tomatoes and then the feta cheese, and eventually you'll get some protein. It's usually in the form of seafood, fish, yeah, so anyways, good to do that. Sophie, one of the things I always say towards the end of the podcast, and I mean this, and it's worth repeating every time we do this, is that the reason we do this podcast is not just to simply satisfy people's intellectual curiosity. Certainly is to provide information, right? Education and knowledge. And you've done that. I've learned a few things along the way here today. So thank you for that. But it always is intended, I hope, to be a call to action. What can people do? So there's people that'll be listening that work in industry and regulatory and some of them academia. They'll be in different capacities. But if they're thinking about, hey, what can I do to try to instill healthier food choices, healthier food availability to impact the health of the nation, or maybe even their own personal lives, any advice that you have? How do you close generally advice for people that, hey, I want to make a difference in whatever capacity or role that I'm in? Any tips of advice that you have for them?
Yeah, it really depends on kind of who the specific audience is. I mean, I've done quite a lot of work in the past in food service and work with chefs, for example. And the big thing there is that chefs are generally very creative people, and they have a really valuable skill set. So what we would say is please use your creativity to create a wider range of healthy, tasty options that are also sustainable, because people go into food service to explore food and they get ideas that they then can take home. So it would be kind of asking the chefs to innovate a little bit more around this area and kind of see if they can start to spark a trend. For retail, we would argue that please try to consider stocking a wider range of plant-based and healthier options, high fiber, kind of lean protein options, and place these next to the unhealthy options so people have they
Mm.
can directly choose and trade off. And there's a number of other what we call nudges you can implement in the retail environment. And in people working in policy, I think it's kind of please read and digest the science on the topic and work with that. There's a massive amount of it available now, but there's always good quality reviews, meta-analyses out there that will actually give you the facts on the foods that are good for people, and they need to go into guidelines, but the guidelines need implementation around them as well, because truly no one's reading the guidelines and no
Mm.
one's following them. So it's about how we get the guidelines to kind of make sense to people and turn into something that they can use and do. And kind of usually when I'm asked this question for the individual, my thing would always be try to eat less red and processed meat. That was my personal agenda because it's a topic area I work on. But to that end, it's kind of like where perhaps you might be choosing beef or other processed meats, consider white meat, consider fish, or consider ideally plant-based sources. And that can have multiple benefits, not just for the planet, but also for personal health. Some really quite strong benefits if you look at the research. So that would be the one that I'd push on quite strongly if I could make
Yeah.
anything happen.
Well, that's great advice. I love the first one, which is just challenge people to be more creative in innovation, because generally a lot of the problems that we face in society, innovation is the way to get through some of these problems. I use this quote a lot that a problem well defined is half solved. So I think this problem of chronic disease is pretty well defined, so it's half solved. But how do we do that? So creativity and innovation. How do you make healthier products more interesting, more affordable, positioning them so that people will make those choices? To your point, there's a lot of data and evidence that's behavioral based, and read it. And if you don't, I would encourage you now, get online and follow Sophie and read her articles and her research. Because I mean, I've read articles by you, Sophie, where just I think it was the size of the dish or the bowl influences how much people eat.
Mhm.
Didn't you write an
Mhm.
article like that? I mean, it's
Yeah, there was one
fascinating
where
to me.
if you serve food in a bowl rather than on a plate, people think it's healthier.
It's amazing.
Just by virtue because you associate bowls with the idea of salad. There's a lot of very implicit, kind of unconscious things that are going into food, and there's a lot of which we haven't talked about today, but kind of identity symbolism. I mean, food is everything; it's everywhere. So it can mean a lot of different things, which makes it fascinating to study, but also, like I said, really complicated to try to influence.
I also like where you position it, right? So if you're a retailer or, you talked about food service, but retail positioning is everything. And so that's why, we like to see grocery stores with fresh produce at the front, right? Because it incentivizes this is where they're going to stop shopping, and hopefully they'll pick up some produce before they go to the middle of the store and up and down aisles. And then I do think we have to continue to work to make healthy food more affordable, right? That's a real challenge. And I know that people can eat healthy even on a constrained budget, right? Because there are foods that you can choose. You and I have talked about the importance of beans, etc. I like that. And then your last call to action, about your own personal diet. And it's interesting as you said that one, because I know it's a little bit conflicted. We just in the United States put out a new food pyramid. You've probably seen it. It's inverted, and beef is at the top. I love beef, so don't get me wrong. I occasionally enjoy a good steak, but I for the past couple of decades I was trained to say limit your red meat consumption, and I really try to gravitate to seafood and fish in particular. And so there's a lot of science under debate. I don't know if you feel that way, Sophie. It's like everything in life has become so polarized. It's like, okay, so what do you believe? But Sophie's been doing this for a long time, and so she's recommending that you be careful about your meat intake. Any last minute pieces of comments or advice?
The core message is that it hasn't actually really there is a lot of debate now, and it's because, kind of clickbait online, but the core message has really been the same for decades now. It's a healthy, balanced diet. And a part of that is kind of, yes, meat intake, but moderate it. So any excess of most things is not very good for your
Right.
health. So I think if you could kind of go back to core principles, really, is then that message hasn't changed really at all. So I'd say that, I mean, the big recommendation is a kind of Mediterranean diet broadly, ideally with a large amount of plant-based content, because that's good for
Mm,
you. And then if you follow that, it's about the best thing you can try to do for your health, bar kind of substances like alcohol and cigarettes, which have a independently damaging effect. But yeah, just kind of going down the route of trying to keep a healthy, balanced diet, keep a body weight that's in the normal range, and some exercise. If you can do that, you can probably do better than about 90% of the population.
that's great. Yeah, and I like the way you closed there, throwing in the alcohol and tobacco, because so often it's left out of the conversation, right? It's just completely left out of the conversation, and all you have to do is go read about the harmful effects of both. And so, people can make choices, but we're just trying to provide good information and advice for people to make smarter choices and live healthier and better lives. Sophie, thank you so much for the time you've dedicated. I know it's late in Athens, so I appreciate it. I appreciate the work that you've done. I continue to follow it and learn from your research and your writings. And we're grateful for the work that you're doing, trying to get people to make smarter food choices, lead healthier and better lives will be good for society. It'll be good for the planet. It'll be good for companies and the government too. So thank you so much. Keep up the good work. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the invite. It's been nice to be here.
All right, that's a wrap for today. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion and found it informative as much as I did. The next episode is already in queue, and it's yet another good one. If you have ideas or suggestions on what we should be talking about, we'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe now, right now, on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, and join us for these important conversations. As I've said many times before, together we're going to learn from one another, and we're going to create a safer, healthier, and smarter food system that benefits food producers, regulators, but most importantly, remember, all of our bosses, the consumer. So stay tuned, we'll talk soon, and until then, be safe.